Many HCI researchers and practitioners contribute to the design and evaluation of mental health interventions. Today, we're excited to present a framework that we believe can guide the design and evaluation of psychosocial interventions and coordinate efforts within and across fields. Globally, we are experiencing a crisis in mental health. Many people cannot access effective, evidence-based treatments where they access healthcare due to the complexity of the interventions and shortages of trained mental health providers. Even when people can access these treatments, they may be delivered with poor fidelity, resulting in limited improvements or a need to re-enter care later. Many health systems and experts have argued that technology can help address some of these challenges. This includes using technology to increase access to interventions and to scale them up or out. It also includes use of technology to increase support for practicing skills or otherwise engaging in a mental health intervention between sessions, potentially increasing its efficacy and long-term stickiness of the skills practiced. Technology-delivered or technology-supported interventions have shown great potential. However, if they're not designed and evaluated appropriately, they may fail to deliver on their promise, or they may increase inequities in who can access mental health care. When researchers and practitioners in HCI and mental health think about how to have positive impacts from the use of technologies to support mental health interventions, we find that there's a need to coordinate our expertise so that these digital mental health technologies can deliver on their promise. This includes coordination among HCI researchers so that our work builds on each other's contributions, as well as between HCI and mental health so that HCI efforts are responsive to priorities in mental health, and so that the health fields can take up the resulting HCI innovations. Here, we argue that a key to coordination among fields is the theories of change that drive all psychosocial mental health interventions. A theory of change describes how an intervention is expected to lead to its effects and under what conditions. It articulates the key components of the intervention and how they interact, the mechanisms of the intervention, the features of the intervention's context are expected to influence those mechanisms, and how the mechanisms of the intervention might influence the context. It is vital that intervention designers consider questions of implementation. How do we support adoption and then make an intervention work sustainably in the destination context at all stages of design and evaluation? And as we work between fields, we find that researchers and practitioners encounter a certain design dilemma, which is how do we balance design innovation with retaining the psychologically active components of an intervention? So for example, if we innovate too much or too freely with our design and we lose those psychologically active components, the system is no longer effective and we've lost that psychological efficacy and the benefits that we're hoping to obtain. On the other hand, if we treat the existing or the previous evidence as the only way to handle an intervention or the only way to deliver it, we can find that we don't innovate enough and we end up reifying the design assumptions that were built into the work that happened in the past and fail to fully address the design challenge that we're working on. And so we think that one of the ways to address this is to reframe intervention design as experience design. And so one of our first key messages today is that we propose that a useful model for HCI designers is to see psychological interventions in mental health as prescribing a particular set of experience trajectories. These experience trajectories are expected to then lead to the desired psychological effects for the participants. And so if we think about what each field brings here, right, HCI tends to think of it in terms of design briefs, what do users need, what can technology deliver, what must happen for someone to have a certain set of experiences. Psychology also, in a way, thinks in terms of design briefs, but those come in the form of these theories of changes that describe the psychologically active components and the way that they interact with their context and the people who go through them. But if we look at them together, they're really describing the set of experiences that participants should have in order to achieve the desired outcome. And so to kind of translate that theory of change into HCI speak or experience trajectories, the ensemble and often sequence, right? So there's a temporal aspect to it of experiences that intervention seeks to create. And then there's expectations about how those experiences are supposed to result in the desired psychological change, right? So those experiences have psychological mechanisms associated with them. They have a psychological function that leads to this change. And it also turns out that theories of change have assumptions under which mechanisms should be expected to operate. So what are the social cultural contexts that would make it work, or under which maybe it wouldn't work, and that kind of bound when you should expect an intervention to work or not. And again, if we kind of go through this list, we can see that this has a lot of connections to the way that we might think about designing for experiences or journeys in HCI, right? These are things that we as a field know how to do. And so a key thing is that we also think it's very important to encapsulate these sets of experiences or individual pieces of them in design briefs, right? And these design briefs, we get into them in more detail in the paper, but they represent a combination of HCI and psychology knowledge, including functionality, constraints, linkages to theory, that then serve as a way that both psychologists and designers can understand and what they're working on or working toward as they build an intervention or pieces of an intervention. All right, and so that actually brings us to our second key point, which is that approaching these series of changes as modular design briefs. All right, so by modular, I mean I started to talk about these different levels at which we might be designing for. And so by thinking of them as modular design briefs, it gives technologists and designers flexibility to imagine new technical and interface capabilities that can implement parts of the functionalities prescribed by a theory of change. It also allows technologists and designers to propose new theories of changes when they look at the technical capabilities that are in front of them and start saying, look, we can build interventions that couldn't have existed before. And so in the paper, we propose 4 different levels of scopes here. That includes an intervention implementation, intervention system, component, and capability. We'll start at the lowest level of these scopes, which is the capability. And so a capability is a basic building block of future interventions. It's a technology piece that does X or a human that provides Y. These could be simple design features that enable capturing mood on a smartphone, a visualization that shows data in an engaging way. So in other words, a capability is a solution to an interaction design problem which we believe could be instrumental in part of a mental health intervention. That could be a future mental health intervention, or we could be saying, oh, you could slot this in here where, we have something that's being done one way and you could add in a different kind of interaction design that also achieves that goal. The next level at a component starts to focus on actually having a psychological function. So if capability was focused on an interaction design problem, components start to focus on some sort of like psychological design problem. It's a set of interactions that will have some impact on the user's mind, often as one step along the way in a theory of change for a given intervention. So an example here might be a feature that supports user self-awareness, or a digitally mediated process that reminds and supports users in applying a relaxation technique from their therapist before bedtime. In other words, an intervention component is no longer just an interaction design, but needs to have targeted psychological effects aligned with the theory of change. However, it doesn't yet need to be your whole intervention. You don't need to evaluate it as part of a whole intervention yet. You just need to show that it achieves that psychological function in kind of localized ways. All right, so let me move up one level in the scope to an intervention system. And this is one that both interaction designers and clinicians often think about as a natural design target when we're talking about designing for mental health, right? We want to jump to that whole intervention system that delivers on a whole theory of change, delivers the full therapeutic effect, impacts key psychological outcomes such as anxiety or depression, right? So an intervention system is an ensemble of components which together should add all the experiences required by the underlying theory of change. Finally, at the highest level here is this level of intervention implementation, which highlights the importance of understanding how interventions are appropriated and delivered in real-world settings. And so this is always going to involve an intervention delivered in a particular socio-cultural context and might require the addition of socio-technical components that help address barriers to implementation. This could be things that help patients access care. They could be things that help train clinicians or others who are delivering the care so that they're prepared to do it well, right? And these might also be called adjunctive interventions in other fields. But the idea is that when you take an intervention system, you're still going to have to do some adaptation and often augmentation of it to make it work in any particular setting, especially if you want it to work in a sustainable way. Right? And so our questions are no longer about here, could this intervention work in an ideal setting, but rather, does it work in this context and how can it be improved? All right, and so that brings us to our third message, which is that you may have noticed as we started talking about these different levels or different scopes of design brief, is that we started talking about that how that kind of scoping allows you to define appropriate evaluation criteria along the way, and appropriate evaluation methods for each of these scopes. And so one of the things that we also really want to argue for here is that by being really clear about the scope at which someone is making a contribution, they can also say this is the appropriate evaluation for that scope. We don't need to do more, or this is sufficient to demonstrate the kind of contribution we're trying to make here. And so if we look at capabilities, you're often doing lab studies or technical benchmarks of that interaction. If we go up to a component, we might be still doing lab studies or remote studies that show it works in field or in context, right? So some in the wild deployments. We're often focusing on proximal measures to show that it is achieving that predicted psychological function, but we're not necessarily looking at long-term health outcomes here yet. When we get into an intervention system, we might be looking at acceptability and feasibility. And these are a little bit kind of implementation-y things, but it's often good to get an initial read on acceptability and feasibility in an ideal setting too. You may be doing RCTs to compare it to another intervention system that's being used in care right now. But again, this is often being evaluated in an ideal environment with a lot of research support. As you get into an intervention implementation, we're often looking at appropriation studies. We're often looking at people's lived experiences within interventions that's been out there for a while, what it's like to actually use in that specific real world context. We're also looking at pragmatic trials that say, if this is what we're actually doing as the intervention, is it something where there's going to be uptake and sustainment? Are people going to deliver this with fidelity over time so that we can expect it to continue working? We're really focused here on sustainable achievement of these long-term health outcomes. And we might also start be looking at things like cost, right? Like, what's it take to sustain continuing to do this? Before we wrap up today, we've talked a lot about scopes and design briefs and their use in designing and evaluating psychosocial interventions. And we don't want to leave you with this idea that that's the only way to use them. There's been this tremendous breadth of kinds of contributions in HCI and mental health, and we hope that our framework can also support those other contribution types as well. And so, for example, we've had some really wonderful HCI contributions that critique practices in digital mental health or mental health care overall. And I would hope that this modular framework could also be used by people writing those critiques for saying, this is a kind of intervention that isn't going to work, or this is the kind of implementation problems that you have, or these components are inappropriate in this use case or something like that. Right. And so I'm hoping that the different scopes also give a vocabulary that those critiques can use, because we need to keep making them if we're going to build a better future. Similarly, there's been a lot of wonderful HCI research that understands people's lived experiences with implemented health interventions or situations in which people might want to access a health intervention or benefit from one, but they can't do so in an equitable way or in a way that is engaging and supportive of kind of their overall well-being. And I think HCI has a lot to say here too. And again, we would hope that the vocabulary we've introduced help some of those arguments land and be really clear to the people who could then act on them and catalyze the direction of the field. And finally, we also know that we've talked about design briefs and what they should contain, but it is also really important to keep articulating sketches of design briefs in a way that can kind of articulate and catalyze a research agenda by saying, I'm imagining this better future. If we could build some things like this, this is what it would take to get there. And then the whole field of HCI and computing can go out and start working on some of those pieces alongside our colleagues in mental health as well. And so to wrap up, we've described a framework for HCI and mental health contributions that works at different scopes and design briefs at each of these scopes that can support coordination within and across fields. And in doing so, we hope that this will link technical innovation to the theories of change that describe mental health interventions, encourage innovation rather than strict application of existing interventions and components, and guide evaluation as commensurate within a contribution scope. And that ultimately this will balance making new mental health interventions possible while also making current mental health interventions better and available to more people. Thank you, and check out the paper for more.